Okay, we have a very different drink with James here. I am here with my favorite college professor, John Daves. Thank you so much for jumping on here. I know I only asked you yesterday, so thanks for making the time.
Anytime. You have been an inspirational person in my life in my 20 years, both at the college and the private school level teaching. Um,
Well,
so can't thank you enough for how you've inspired me as an educator.
I appreciate that. And I also got to shoot your wedding not too long ago, which was
Yes.
fun. So, John and I have a great relationship, which has gone from me calling him Professor Daves to me being able to call him John, which is still a little bit weird for me, but I'm getting more and more used to it. But look, I wanted to bring you on the show today because I grew up in a 12,000 square foot house. I did not have a single Black person in my high school, my private Christian high school in Georgia. And I went to a very nice, expensive school where you were my teacher in American Studies. And I remember you teaching us about white privilege, and I honestly had never heard of it. Like it wasn't even a concept that I was really aware of. And growing up in the South, I was surrounded by racists and racism, and my family are New Yorkers, and that was never part of the way we were raised. But we weren't raised to also be able to see the world from other people's point of view, to be able to understand that we didn't hit that triple, that we were born on third base. And your class was transformative for me, not just the class, the multiple classes I took from you, but also our conversations while I was in school and after. And so I wanted to bring the guy who taught me, and I think probably a lot of other people a lot like me, some of these things which today are talked about quite a bit more. So I think a good place to start is maybe just defining a few terms that people are seeing, right? Protests are going on, and people are talking about this at a velocity that I've never experienced. And I assume does this feel different? First of all, is this
It,
like?
it is different in this sense, James, that it's national.
Mm-hmm.
So, when I was in college in 1992, there were the LA riots
Mm-hmm.
and there was the OJ Simpson trial. OJ was national in the sense that everybody saw it and they saw the two Americas emerge
Mm-hmm.
from that trial. When Rodney King happened in the LA riots, that was really there.
Mm-hmm.
That riot was in LA. What's happening now really hasn't happened since Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, where it's everybody around the country and now around the world has some entry point into institutional racism and systemic racism is now hitting everybody's consciousness on some level.
Mm-hmm.
And the touch point is sort of police brutality as an illustration of it. And the metaphor that I think a lot of people are operating with is the police officer's knee on George Floyd's neck. And that metaphor is sort of society being on Black people and people of color's neck and not allowing them to breathe and stifling and preventing them from really having a quality of life where they're not feeling some form of trauma, anxiety, fear in their daily life.
Yeah. And I know I said I wanted you to define these terms, but now we're talking and I want to keep going down that thread. I think I've seen a lot of people on social, a lot of influencers, and a lot of the influencers we work with are white, and a lot of them have been posting and saying, hey, I'm trying to educate myself. I'm trying to see the world in a different way. Now, when I entered your class, the first thing we read was Invisible Man. by Ralph Ellison. Why, when you go to teach a group of young 18-year-old white kids that the world is not fair and that it's tipped in their balance, why did you start with that book?
Well, it's a perfect way for us to unpack some terms through that book, right? So if you think about Ralph Ellison's book and that idea of being invisible or rendered invisible, well, he's talking about what it means to be Black and society refusing to acknowledge, recognize him as a human being, and that the creation of race robs him of visibility.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you look at white privilege, there's another sort of socialization process that occurs, right? Where white people are conditioned not to see themselves as white and not understand the dynamic that if you don't see it, then how can you be it?
Yeah.
And then language comes out of that. Well, I don't see race, I'm colorblind. And as this dynamic is occurring, you don't realize that those privileges of not being able to see race come from somewhere. Well, where do they come from? Well, they come from a binary of how our language in America works, English language works. So if you're not a boy, then you're a girl.
Mm-hmm.
If it's daytime, then it's going to be nighttime at some point. So the privileges and the identity comes from that dynamic of Black and white, right? So if Black is wrong, and it has the adjectives that are associated with that, then white is right, but you don't have to see yourself as white to construct an image of innocence and not being attuned to reality that has created this identity that you're not having to pay attention to, which then creates its own form of isolation and invisibility of the living history of how you're seen through the world's eyes. Because being white means that you don't have the self-awareness that other people of color and Black people have to have on a daily basis. And what I think has really charged us for the first time, and a lot of Black people talk about this, is that this is the first white president. This is the first president who, other than the appearance of having money, really has not had any qualifications that other previous presidents have had to be in office.
Mm-hmm.
And what has been the impetus of him becoming president? Well, he used racism and race to galvanize and hijack a coalition of conservative white people who aren't aware often of the unconscious racism and anxiety that was perhaps triggered by having an exceptional political athlete who happened to be African American be president for 8 years.
Mm-hmm.
So that level of understanding of invisibility from a Black standpoint, as well from a white standpoint, and how that has been ingrained, and white people have been socially conditioned, as you told your story. Where is the place for white people to look at themselves as white and from a different perspective, right? You being in my class and you having to do some of that work enabled you to understand your white identity, to develop an understanding of it. But where are the forum for white people to really understand when they feel threatened, when they feel like something is being taken away? When do they feel like it's okay to actually even talk about their own understanding of their racial identity in relation to the world? Those spaces have not been created, and Donald Trump was able to consciously play upon that because he saw an opportunity. And the aftermath might be, it might be the first time that American moral literacy, America's ability to lead, is going to be in question because of that lack of self-awareness,
Mhm.
because of that inability to see itself in relation to the world, because of the choice that was made, because there wasn't a form to understand whiteness and white identity, only the notion of it being invisible and non-existent until you hire a white president who's not qualified to lead the country and the world.
Yeah. It reminds me of like James Baldwin saying that, Christianity had lost its moral like high ground because of the Third Reich.
Correct.
Because Nazi Germany was a Christian nation, Christians just can no longer claim moral hierarchy over the rest of the world, right? That like you've lost that ability by your actions. I think maybe Christianity, there's a few other things that probably also precludes them from taking that high ground. But is that where you see this going? Do you think that like America loses that kind of moral leadership, or was it ever really there?
Well, it was there for what I would call the century, from World War I up until today. From the 20th century into the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
The question really is, how will it continue now that the country, in a sense, and its leadership has been exposed, because it has not looked at its history, because it has not looked at white identity development and the living history with that. I mean, when you were talking about Christianity and how that's been exposed, well, it was exposed because of how it was used as a tool for colonialism and imperialism, and then neo-colonialism and imperialism, right? And basically that means, when a dominant nation and culture literally uses Christianity to create a superior inferior dynamic with its subjects.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the irony here is, the country that became dominant was a colony, right? And we sometimes tend to forget we went from a colony to being, the architects of a new form of neo-colonialism and imperialism that the country has benefited from since World War I. So when you don't look at that history and you just assume expertise because of the status that you've acquired or inherited at the expense of others, as Baldwin sometimes would say, the bill will come in. Well, the bill came in terms of the choices that were made when people no longer trusted facts, when they didn't think about meritocracy from the perspective of race and class, when you created not only two Americas based upon race, but two Americas based upon social class, and one America based upon social class felt so alienated from elites that they elected a reality TV figure.
Right.
And then they said, well, okay, we can live in an alternate reality that is propped up by a sense of race pride that we may or may not understand. Mm-hmm. And the rest of the world will suffer. Now, one of the things that's so important about what we're talking about is the Electoral College elected Trump, not the popular vote.
He did lose the popular vote, yeah.
So we're also then talking about a one of the two parties in this country creating an Electoral College advantage in rural areas that they were using to obtain and maintain power at the expense of the majority of the country. And how that also impacted the notion of white privilege based upon class, that they were using working class white people for their own expense, And that caught up to them as well, because they didn't realize that they had lost control of that mechanism to obtain and maintain power.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm talking about there is the difference of privilege between elite privilege with a capital E of, the Bush, the Reagan, Romney, to the appearance of a populist president and Donald Trump, who wants acceptance and admission from that elite, but has figured out how to at least use a base that the Republican Party created to obtain and maintain power. And then microaggressions, acts of violence towards people of color, becomes normalized.
Mm-hmm.
And once that happens, then you have what we have today, which is people of color, the majority of the country, saying enough.
Yeah. Yeah. And how important, it struck me as you're talking about this idea of two worlds, right? And other. And that's, a lot of times people need the other side of a coin to be able to define themselves. Mm-hmm. How central to America is this black versus white, like these two Americas. And, I guess that's the first question, just like how central is that to the way people see themselves? And then moving forward, is there a different way to see ourselves, right? Because I think that, I don't see color, that came out of increased awareness around race and people being like, no, so I'm not racist, I don't see color, right? So like, what does that new reality look like then?
Well, the new reality comes from the old one. So, your first question reminded me of something that James Baldwin wrote in the 60s, a letter from the region of my mind, where he said, race and racism will end as soon as white people are able to look at themselves from a different perspective and don't need to define themselves from labeling us as other. Mm-hmm. That racism, from his point of view, is not a black-white problem, it's a white problem.
Yep.
So, the tools to be able to look at yourself from a different point of view without having to label somebody as other and less than in order to feel comfortable and confident in your own skin is really the challenge of understanding and people looking at the living history of white supremacy, institutional racism, and the legacy of systemic racism from slavery to segregation to Jim Crow and to today.
Yeah. Right? And as a teacher, right? There's a lot of thought leaders and people on the internet that are talking about a lot of these issues and that show you that you're racist. But like in some ways that was your job, right? You had to come in and you had to force your students to try and see themselves. So like as many of the people watching this show or listening to it may not have made that switch yet, that unlock of really being able to see yourself. What are the tools like that you use to get people who are in that privileged position to see themselves in that new light? Like what can people actually do?
Well, it's now an incentive, right? Beyond just moral literacy and ethical morality. The incentive is, are you prepared for today and tomorrow when a world is interdependent and interconnected? And there's a real question of what it means to be an American and what it means to lead as an American during and post-Trump. So if you don't develop the second sight, being the ability to see yourself through the eyes of others, if you're white, can you do cross-cultural competency? Can you conduct business and be respected and admitted and accepted if you perpetuate ignorance and blindness from other people's point of view, and you then inherit a label of being a Donald Trump, how well will your business do in that marketplace?
Right.
So now it really is about a clock ticking, right? And we used to say that there's a metaphor out there that there's levels of at risk for our country in terms of students that are prepared for interdependent, interconnected workforce. Well, the red at risk are kids that just graduate from high school. They don't have the skills to even compete in a global economy. Yellow might be kids that, graduate from college but don't have the skill set. Green could mean you know how to do school well, but you're not agile and self-aware enough to know how to learn, and know how to navigate maybe 6 or 7 job changes in your career, and be able to not only know and perform, but actually understand and apply information, make it relevant to the experiences that you happen to find yourself in. My father used to always say to me, language is like clothes, just make sure it matches the occasion you happen to be in. And colors now is about how well do you understand race, class, and gender? How well do you understand your story in relation to the world around you and the occasions you happen to be in? That's the matching you have to do. And if you are not self-aware, you will look like a yesteryear, and the world will move on without you.
You think we're there? You think that we've gotten to a place now where not just not being a racist, like that's not enough, that you have to be a modern leader, really understand those things, really truly be able to see yourself through the eyes of others?
Well, let's think about it this way. The slogan that won Trump the election with that electoral college was MAGA, Make America Great Again, a return to a nostalgic past that did not exist.
Right.
If you don't have the ability to see yourself from a different point of view, where are you in that nostalgia?
Yeah.
Are you stuck in a past that didn't exist, or are you able to think about today and tomorrow? And that's a question that, we will be wrestling with every generation, right? From baby boomers to Gen X to millennials and beyond. Do you have the agility and understanding of how to apply what you understand through your ability to see yourself from a variety of different point of views and ask the right questions and make yourself relevant to those questions and figuring out those questions together? That will be vital to determining what the next chapter of your life in America looks like.
And what, I have a fear that, it has become, that people are making statements about Black Lives Matter and about standing in solidarity with the protesters without unlocking the understanding, with feeling the pressure that they have to post something because they're a public figure or a brand, without the understanding action. I think you talked about that, how like it's about not being able to see yourself, but being able to then put that into action. And I guess it's a journey, and I guess the question is, like, how can you push people along? How do you explain this in the most simple way if someone's like, I don't believe in white privilege, I don't think it exists. What do you say to that?
The best way to kind of explain white privilege to somebody is to say, when was the first time you had to think about having to look at yourself from a different point of view? when was the first time you really had to be in a situation where you were the only one who looked different than everybody else? When was the first time that you had to think about living in a place that had been labeled as bad?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you can answer any of those questions, congratulations, you have some self-awareness. If you struggle and get defensive
Mm-hmm.
and start saying, well,
My family didn't have that much money either growing up.
right. And I start, telling a different story, or saying I'm not racist, or I just think everybody should be treated equally. It means that your vocabulary with regards to self-awareness, stamina, and literacy is low.
Mm-hmm.
It means that, if life is a marathon and the skills that you need to run that marathon well in terms of your personal and career life, you're not in the greatest of shape. It doesn't mean that you can't train for that.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that you can't improve, but it means that you don't have the wherewithal to tell your story in relation to the world and how the world has functioned for centuries in America and globally.
Mm-hmm.
And this is now the first time in our history where having to look at yourself from a different point of view as an American can really determine how successful you are going to be. And that scared people enough to vote for Donald Trump. We're not sure what the implications of another election of Donald Trump means, but we do have some understanding from the world that could mean we leave America behind, and we, in a sense, also leave you behind.
Mm-hmm.
So it's now fairly easy to sort of say to somebody, privilege is the ability not to have to ask yourself questions about who you are and where you've come from, and you're able to subscribe to an ideology without thinking about it, of individualism, that you put yourself up by your bootstraps, and you think you started at first base, where the rest of the world realizes, no, you really started at third.
Mm-hmm. I remember you telling me a story of a gifted student in Washington, D.C. who used to have to hide in the bathroom during the award ceremonies because he'd get the shit beaten out of him,
Yep.
and you asked, the class of, I'm sure it was mostly white kids, if they ever felt like they had to hide if they received an academic reward. And I think so much of what, of that class for me, especially early on in the first part of it, was really understanding it's not just about overcoming poverty, which is almost insurmountable, but then to be in, to be in that situation, to be a gifted kid in that school achieving, and then to have what seemed like everyone trying to pull him back into the bucket,
Right. Well, what you're talking about is how the system sends a message that you're not supposed to aspire to use education for social mobility. That there's a single-mindedness imposed upon you by society by putting you in the ghetto. And then there's the internalized racism of having to subscribe and adopt that view of single-mindedness, so that school is seen as a child's game. That is something that you have to outgrow to really live in the single-minded reality that you've inherited and that you are shackled to. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're living in a, as Christopher Hayes says, colony within a nation, right? Well,
what's that mean exactly?
Well, Cedric Jennings, the young man you're talking about, is born in the colony, right? He's shackled to a reality that has been imposed upon him. But the people in the nation live in the suburbs. School is something you can exchange for a career and an opportunity and an identity to gain access to the American dream. But if you live in the colony, that's not how the system works. And there's a single-mindedness that your life, unless you have a gimmick, unless you can sing or play basketball or a sport, that you will not be admitted and accepted within the fabric of American society.
Mm-hmm. And I remember even in Invisible Man, the main character doesn't get to go to college until he debases and humiliates himself for the entertainment of white people.
Correct.
And then he gets a stack of cash.
Correct.
That lets him go to school.
So if you think about something that Michael Jordan had to learn, right? And this is a Black billionaire, just to build off of what you just said, James. When he was asked to be part of a movement for social justice, which is to reframe power dynamics for equity so that everybody has access to the riches and the promise of American life, the democracy that we market as what makes us the greatest country in the world. He said, well, Republicans buy sneakers too.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was a way of sort of saying that money means more than my principles, my values, my ethics, my moral literacy. Well, today he says, I've had enough. I need to stand with a generation of basketball players who refuse to just live by, just shut up and dribble. So what does that mean when the consummate performer, the man who said Republicans buy sneakers too, has joined a new movement of social activist-minded athletes who only got admitted and accepted into American society through a gimmick and are aware of it. Hmm. So Baldwin was speaking to us, figures of the civil rights movement were speaking to us. Ralph Ellison, somebody of the 50s, Invisible Man was published in 1952. And they're saying invisibility, rendering people invisible, even the people that have privilege, perhaps is the biggest threat to our democracy, to the principles and values of what it means to be an American, and the potential and promise of America to continue to lead.
Yeah.
Because it aspires to be the best version of itself. And what we have seen in the last 4 years is a regression, a return to something darker out of fear of America becoming that city on the hill, because it has made choices of saying, I will do what it means to be an American as long as it benefits me and at the expense of others. And that history began with America's original sin of racism and slavery. Mm-hmm. And we have not confronted it. And until we start to look at the invisibility and the people that have profited from it and thought that they escaped the debilitating effects of invisibility, until they look at themselves and say, wow, invisibility affects the oppressor and the oppressed, how can we lead?
Yeah.
How can we be who we say we are to ourselves and to other people if we can't hold the mirror up to ourselves and say, I am living by these principles. I am thinking about an I and a we. I am an embodiment of the best values of what it means to be an American. I am asking myself questions of how I relate to society and the rest of the world. I am developing a moral literacy through my ability to talk about myself in relation to what's happening in America's living history. Until we develop that agility and are not just knowing and performing for our own self-interest, we will return to a path that never really existed in the way that we thought it did. And we will be divorced from a reality that provides us with the ability to grow. We will be stuck.
And is that what Baldwin was saying when he said that, black people can't be free until white people are
Correct.
free of this stain?
Correct. Until white people begin to understand white identity development and can come to terms with who they are, not through the expense of this living history and ignoring it and thinking that the invisibility that they've created it is an invincibility, which has been promoted, until they really wrestle with that and become comfortable in their own skin and seeing themselves from a different point of view. And that's really a barometer of being comfortable in your own skin. We really can't say and illustrate we are who we say we are. As the city on the hill, as the greatest nation in the world, this election, the Make America Great Again, is an opportunity to say, who do we want to be and where do we want to lead? Or do we want to return to a past that never existed and allow other nations to occupy a space that we felt we had earned?
Yeah.
Because the country says one thing and the world is now saying, maybe that American country that said in marketing was just a great marketing scheme. And it was really about what they felt they were entitled to and not something that they were constantly willing to work on.
Yeah. And is that, to bring it back to today, is that, people have asked me, what's the end game? What is the, where do these protests go? Are they, is it our ability as white America to see ourselves? Are the protests the mirror that make us look at those injustices that rub our nose in the world we've created every single day and show it through protesters being beaten and tear gas and all, and I guess, is that the point of this protest? And as we look back to civil rights, was that what those were, what those protests were about as well?
I would say the protests are about mirrors and second sight, right? The mirror is, can you look at yourself in the mirror and be comfortable with what you see and tell the story that you told at the beginning of our session? This is how I began to understand who I am as a white man. So that's the mirror. The second sight is the work, right? Are you able to see yourself through the eyes of others? Are you able to see that living history? Are you able to anticipate, develop empathy and moral literacy skills so that you can communicate what you understand in a shared understanding of how you're helping yourself through how you help others and yourself learn how to learn?
Yeah.
From a position of insight and awareness and self-awareness, not privilege in a sense of entitlement. And that's a real risk if you ignore it, if you continue to subjugate and create a lack of self-awareness as your daily life, as Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about, living in the fantasy of the American dream with apple pie and ice cream, then that return to that sense of nostalgia where the violence and all the other things that created those privileges were devoid of your reality, we're seeing the bill come in. We're seeing what happens when that neglect, that not addressing police brutality, systemic racism, the binary of black and white, suburban areas, rural, and the suburbs, right? Those realities, everything is now interconnected. So unless you're able to lean into the discomfort and start to understand yourself in relation to that history and world, we're in real trouble. And you'll continue to see the virus, because racism and what we're talking about is no different than the coronavirus. And if you think about it, how does the coronavirus affect the population? It affects people that are at risk. In the same way that racism and American racism, that living history affects
Mm.
in the same way that social class affects.
Yeah.
And it's on the politics of location of race, class, and gender that we've also constructed, right? So it's the coronavirus is a great metaphor to kind of look at what happens when you don't address a living history of race and racism that has now operated in our society as a virus that can threaten all of us, and America's promise and potential.
I think that's a great metaphor, and I think in some ways, then the protests maybe act as the lockdown, things that were meant to stop the spread, to make you take this seriously. Finally, take this seriously, because people are dying every day of it, and it is not just the problem of the people dying. It is the responsibility of the country to make dramatic changes to stop our fellow Americans from being killed.
Right.
For no reason.
Correct. And it's the people that have the advantages that have to make the right decisions.
Mm-hmm. And I want to talk about that, because it is I think that's a core difficulty of this change, is that as the country becomes a more just, fair, and equitable place, it means that people in the position of privilege have less of a head start, and they're in the same race. So they're saying, I'm going to let everyone else take a couple steps up, and have the starting line be in the same place. How do you get people to act against what is invariably in their self-interest? Is it that we make it not in their self-interest anymore?
No. What this virus has taught us about self-interest, there's lessons here. If race and racism and the manipulation, exploitation of race and racism is a virus, well, what did we learn from the virus? Well, we've learned that you can't escape it. We're all in the same boat. Eventually, the virus will touch all of us. You can think that you're immune from it until it touches you. And how does the virus spread? Well, it spreads through people that can travel. Not everybody can travel. There are people in this country who've never been on a plane.
Yeah. I think it's 30 or 35% never been on.
Correct. Right? So now you're saying, similar to that lack of self-awareness, I could have this virus and not know it. Mm-hmm. And then it hits me. And now I know something that has been with me all along. And now it's impacted my life, and it's changed my understanding of I am not an isolated, individualistic entity. I am an agent, a human being that works in conjunction with the world that I happen to be in. Mm. And if I don't learn how to match my identity with the occasions and the life and contributions that I'm able to make to the larger whole, this violence of virus and violence of thinking of myself solely as a unit independent of what's happening around me, and it's only about a single-minded pursuit of wealth and success, well, there's going to be a consequence for that that will even prevent me from being able to measure myself according to just that standard.
How is that?
You won't be here. We won't be here. Right?
And when you say, earlier you said that the invisibility of Black people, is the, the greatest threat to the fabric of America that we have. And I was reminded of a Lyndon Johnson quote where he said, you put your foot on the back of someone's neck for 300 years and let them up. Don't be surprised when they knock your block off.
Correct. But one of the things that's happened is, whether you're talking about Nelson Mandela or Barack Obama, the dignity or the human grace of trying to challenge the race and racism and the immorality and the inhumanity of systems of oppression has enabled them to be the best protectors of moral literacy and humanity and grace against the virus of violence and racism and oppression. Because they know the danger to the greater good if they got up and just acted in terms of a sense of revenge. They know that the virus would spread and consume us all if they did that. So they've done the exact opposite. They've created a way of forming a treatment. The vaccine comes from us having a much larger understanding that a simplistic notion of individualism and meritocracy is just an ideology you've used for a single-minded pursuit. But now you have to see that you're kind of in the same boat with everybody else, that all of those aspirations have to be in concert with what contributions are you making to the larger society so that your livelihood in that materialistic pursuit can continue to flourish and survive.
Mm-hmm.
If everybody is catching a virus and it's preventing them from being able to go to restaurants and support themselves, what good is all the money if you can't go anywhere and do anything with it?
Right.
And that's what we're learning right now. Yeah. That if it's single-minded pursuit of materialism without looking at the health of the larger society and the role that we all play, what happens to ourselves, what happens to the economy as a whole? And that's the lesson here, right? Maybe Trump would have gotten away with a single-minded pursuit of America first at the expense of the world if there wasn't something that said, we really are in this life together because it's not just a global economy. We're part of a humanity that is tied. And the problem then is, if you've created this binary of black and white, inferior, superior, who are you running from? And where can you run to? Because the inferior has made your superior and privileged life possible. Until you're comfortable looking at that and looking at yourself in relation to that, you're not going anywhere.
Yeah. That is a powerful explanation. And I've got 3 more questions because I know we could talk all day.
Sure.
You talk about Nelson Mandela, Barack Obama, elegance, intelligence, eloquence, and we could have a whole other conversation because I know early in your class with me, you talked about passing and, what, America is comfortable with, what kind of Black people we're comfortable with in leadership positions, but that's a whole nother conversation. But, but Colin Kaepernick took a knee and nobody did anything. And Barack Obama was our generation's great president. We will never see another one for another generation like him. And it created Trump. So I think there are a lot of people who probably have family members who are saying, why the protests? Why the riots? I understand. I don't think it's right that cops should kill Black people, but why are they destroying property? Why are these riots? Why are there protests? How do you square a Barack Obama with, a police station burning? How do those fit into the story? And how should people who are speaking to maybe family members that don't live in these communities, don't live in these cities, who are asking that question, how do you explain that?
I explain it as how Barack Obama had to see himself through the eyes of America. And how often could he be a Black president? And in most cases, he had to be a president who happened to be Black. Now,
what's the difference there? Just
a Black president can look at American history from a Black point of view and challenge America to live up to its principles by really confronting institutional and systemic racism. A president who happens to be Black cannot. They have to only rely on second sight, only rely on seeing themselves through the eyes of the dominant culture, which means repairing, protecting, upholding the institutions without the direct challenge of looking at systemic racism, institutional racism. And we have to think about what the successes for Barack Obama were. Saving the car industry, saving the economy from itself because it was on the verge of collapse, through governments protecting the private sector, protecting banks and businesses. George Bush started it reluctantly, and Barack had to finish it. And then literally helping to manage some of that debt before he left. Those were the things that most people will say off the top of their head that they remember. Nowhere in that is what we're talking about right now.
Right. Is criminal justice reform or any of, legalizing marijuana, getting rid of all the bullshit marijuana charges that people are spending their life in jail for, like all the things that are systemic and meant to keep Black people in jail and as an other.
Correct.
Fix
now,
education,
immigration, all of those things, right? So, and the other thing that they would say is healthcare, that he saved the institution of healthcare as a culture of entitlement that everybody should have access to, right? He continued that belief in that tradition, protecting that institution. All of the things that you just mentioned, a Black president could have been able to do. But he was not allowed to do that. And if we think about when Dr. Henry Louis Gates, W.E.B. Du Bois professor at Harvard University, was arrested at his own home, even after he showed identification and taken down to the precinct, Barack Obama said that the police acted stupidly in that instance. There was so much uproar about Barack Obama saying that, that there had to be a beer summit. Remember this?
Yeah.
And they had to invite the white police officer to the White House. And Joe Biden had to be there as a way of saying, this is just a president who happens to be Black. White society, white America, we're okay here with Barack Obama. And it is ironic that the only person that the country felt out of all of the Democratic candidates was Joe Biden.
Yeah.
Because he's supposed to be the transition and the healer and the one who was able to be the advocate to white society, to white America, about this extraordinary man who was not able to be fully himself because he had to only, for most of his presidency, serve as a president who happened to be Black and not address the problems and the virus that was affecting us during his presidency, prior to, and has hit us in another way because of the fear and anxiety of him being in office in 8 years, and somebody who returned us to a past that didn't exist because we weren't able to look at ourselves.
And so is that, do the protests happen because Black America has tried? They've, a Black man was president, right? That was, 1950, 1960, unthinkable.
Right.
That happened, and it was it that the peaceful kind of, we're playing nice, we're going to play by white America's rules, that way of changing things just wasn't working, and people said, fuck it, let's burn this country down, let's burn the system down? What's like, where do those protests sit in that journey? And how can white people who are looking at it saying, I don't understand why we're protesting?
Well, when Martin Luther King, a young man, didn't reach 50, said television is going to save us, because most of white America doesn't see what happens to us on a daily basis. And once they see what the police have do to us on a daily basis, they will be behind us because of the integrity in the American people and in white society. Well, what do we have now? We have camera phones. And cameras on our phones saved us. And they saw a man who wasn't violent, who was pleading in a very polite way just to be able to breathe. Just be able to breathe and live. So what you're seeing now is not just Black and people of color protesting. You also see people in the suburbs protesting alongside Black and people of color. So, wow, now you have a generation that was raised with Barack Obama, who has an understanding of systemic racism and institutional racism, and has seen their own version of a polite African American plead for his life and just to breathe. That is no different than what happened with baby boomers and the nonviolent protest for equity and justice in American life.
The photo of the dogs attacking that young man in Alabama, the photos of a 15-year-old girl trying to just walk to school as people spit on her, those, and is that part of what is so powerful about these protests, is that they allow us, or they force us to not be able to avoid this conversation that we've been trying to not have for 400 years?
Well, without a doubt. And even Frederick Douglass, the first historian of the Black experience in American life, said to us, and it's living words and it's living history, without struggle and protest, there's no progress. And what I've learned is each generation has the same struggle, the same protest, and the same fight for progress. The question is, will America learn and grow this time?
Mm-hmm. How do you think this ends?
And I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. But the foundation is there for them to learn and for progress to happen, or for us to return to a time or a new kind of living history where this generation is not able to enjoy the stage of the world as an American in the same way that previous generations have enjoyed the stage of the world as Americans. And that's what the struggle and process is about.
Yeah. As you know, a Black man, do you feel optimistic and hopeful, or do you feel, you know, yeah, where do you feel this is going?
Um, in a lot of ways, I kind of feel like it's too early to tell.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Protest, struggle is good to see, the fact that it's national and international. But I don't know if it's disciplined. I don't know if struggle and protest leads to the discipline for people to fill out the census and vote. I don't know if um, businesses like yours and um, owners of sports teams will develop the social justice and moral literacy to lead over a sustained period of time. Um, I don't know if the vocabulary that we've shared becomes part of the fabric of American culture and American life, and a new generation is educated in ways in which previous generations have not been educated to do the ongoing struggle, protest, fight that is not always in the street. It's sometimes in the boardroom,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's sometimes with the politicians and whether or not the policies, the bills are about us or just about an us and them, or at the expense of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
As a people. So it's too early to tell. I will know and have a sense of this direction um, if this was just a detour rather than a direction in terms of where we are now, in terms of who we choose in terms of leadership.
Yeah.
Who shows up at the polls?
Yeah.
And then we'll know, because that will be the evolution from struggle, protest to discipline, systemic change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We've also learned from the virus that who's in office and government does matter.
Yeah.
And I think we forgot that. We learned in crisis that government and the private sector matters, and we learned that lesson in 2008. What are we going to learn this time about government, private sector, moral literacy, self-awareness, skills that will cultivate and provide spaces for America that has lost its way to find its way and continue to be a leader of not only itself and the country, but of the world. And there are a lot of questions and there are more questions than there are answers at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But I try and remain hopeful. My former students, you at the top of the list, give me hope because you teach not because you're going to be a millionaire or a billionaire. You teach because you have hope in the future, and you hope that that future comes through your students being able to find their places to lead and ask the right questions of themselves and the world, and their success provide them opportunities to continue to do that work. So my hope comes in my former students like you. It doesn't come in terms of what I see in terms of a forecast yet.
Mm-hmm.
But if you guys are in positions to lead and the discipline doesn't come, and people learn how to learn and act, then we can regain our footing, we can find our direction again, and we can make tomorrow better today.
Wow. I think that's a beautiful way to end this conversation. I really appreciate the time. And I don't think you're on social, are you?
Well, I'm on Facebook and I just got on Twitter.
Okay.
I'm in X here.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get you there eventually. But if anyone wants to continue the conversation, maybe I can share your email address with them. Or
yeah, absolutely.
And maybe as the situation continues, we can continue to have these conversations. I don't think one chat is not enough. We need to keep talking about this, and so maybe we'll have you back here in the next couple of months. All right, John. Thank you so much.
Yeah, take care of yourself,
I
James. I'll talk to you
appreciate it.
soon. Okay.